Greetings, system failure listeners. Nate here, Brian way over there in Rhode Island. Brian, how are things down in the Ocean State today? It is the Ocean State, right? Rhode Island is the Ocean State?
That's a good question. I'm not sure what the state motto and state bird are down here yet. But I would say on the whole, it's pretty rainy. In that about 55% of the time, it's cloudy or overcast or raining.
Has that been a constant theme since you moved down there to the Ocean State, which is Rhode Island? I'm looking up here on the internet. We had a nice sunny middle of the day yesterday up here towards the main side of New England.
We've had a few sunny days, but I would say on the whole, about 55% of the time, it's not sunny.
That's interesting. Why would so obviously we all know that Seattle and Portland, Oregon are stuck in the clouds because the Cascade Mountains, they block the flow of moisture coming off the Pacific, so unlike let's say the eastern half of Oregon is deserty, but the western half is soaking wet, and the same with Washington State. Would there be some kind of similar dynamic going on with Rhode Island? Why would it be that? Is that something that's known down there in Rhode Island? Does everyone talk about how it's constantly rainy like they do with Seattle, or is it just been bad luck of the draw these past few weeks? What's the theory?
Well, let's see. I'm not exactly sure. I talked to some people, and I think the impression was that it kind of rains a lot. Although, up in Portland, my experience was that it's been raining a lot through most of the summers. And then also, when you're watching the New England Patriots, you're rooting for blizzards, but often it's just rain, and that's just the weather pattern down here. But I'm unclear. So I guess it was cloudy yesterday and it's rainy today, but you actually got some sunshine yesterday. And then what are you experiencing today?
It is rainy and drizzly. I can hear the rain, bouncing off the roof even as we speak here, Brian.
All right. Well, maybe it's just a bit more rainy down here.
Maybe. Well, we'll see. I've obviously never lived in Rhode Island, so it's always interesting to get accustomed to a new climate. Speaking of our New England Patriots, you are really close to Foxborough now, I should think, by the geography. Have you ever Google mapped your location to Foxborough? I mean, if we meet up for a game down there at Gillette this year, you're going to be home hours and hours before I get home.
I have not Google mapped it, but I assume it's pretty darn close because I am right on the border of Massachusetts.
And then also, speaking of New England sports, our Boston Bruins begin their quest for the cup this evening at 7:30 p.m. We're really 7:40, and then we'll be lucky to drop the puck by 7:40. And this is only the first game of the first round. If the Bruins are lucky enough to advance further, we can really expect a bevy of commercials and delays getting these games started, pushing the third period climax of the game out till 10:30 at night. But that's okay. It's a hell of a TV product. Brian, how do you handicap the Bruins' chances against the Buffalo Sabres? The Sabres returning to the playoffs for the first time since 2011. Quite a drought for the Sabres. I think that the only team to have a longer playoff drought is the New York Jets, who haven't been in the playoffs since 2010, when they were last seen beating the Bill Belichick and Tom Brady edition of the Patriots back in 2010. But I don't know. I feel like I don't think the Bruins are that good. I feel like I'm going to be putting $10 on every game here in my DraftKings app, but I expect to end up with my DraftKings account hitting zero before this series is over. What do you think, Brian? Any more optimism on your end?
Well, I don't really know the particulars of the Sabres lineup. Are they a bunch of fast dudes, or do they have a bunch of, tough, gritty players who are sizable?
I think both. They have a bunch of their trout pond is stocked with high draft picks. Some of them have flown the coop, but they had all these number 1 and number 2 picks for years. They were like the Edmonton Oilers of the East. They had all these number 1 and number 2 picks for years, but could never establish any kind of traction and just lost all their games. They even brought in Coach Lindy Ruff, they fired him in 2012 or 13 or something. Finally brought him back. Before that he had coached the Sabres for 10 or 15 years or something like that. And I think he was the coach back in when the Sabres got denied the cup in 1999, when Brett Hull, then playing for the Dallas Stars, was in the crease, causing a crucial disallowed goal for Buffalo, and that was one where the Dallas Stars went on to win the Stanley Cup. But what happened was the players all got together and decided to somehow find motivation or something. They managed to right the ship somehow. And my understanding, it was the players' impetus and not so much the coaches. Anyway, it'll be an interesting series. I always love it when the NHL playoffs come around. So we'll be curious to see whether or not the Bruins can manage to muster a decent showing in the first round, and who knows, maybe they can even upset the top seed in the Atlantic Division, those Sabres.
Well, the thing about those Buffalo Sabres is they may have rallied and put together a winning season, but, playoff grit is another matter entirely. And I don't know how many playoff games they have in the room. I'd have to fathom not that many. And so,
yeah, probably not a single one. I won't pull up the Sabres roster here, the Sabres current roster, but it's going to be pretty light on playoff experience. All their big players like Rasmus Dahlin will have, of course, 0 games of playoff experience under their belt. So that will be a factor. You're right. There's no playoff pedigree up there in Buffalo, with 15 years in between playoff appearances.
Overall, I guess my opinion is that this is a good opportunity for your sports betting account to bet on a Bruins underdog team that at least has some playoff experience. And it's just new playoff team versus spoiler in the Bruins, So should be exciting.
Yep, I'm looking forward to tonight. I regret the Bruins don't have one of the matinee games. Well, on the one hand, I would love the matinee games for just scheduling convenience versus having to wait all the way till 7:30 p.m. just to see your playoff action. But the Bruins are also notoriously languid during the matinee slot, so maybe it's for the best that they're playing late.
Well, perhaps you notice that the Bruins do have a matinee game next Sunday at 2:00.
Yes, I did, but much to my everlasting regret, I'm going to be watching that game from the Baltimore airport. I got to fly down to Florida real quick this weekend for a buddy's birthday party, and I have a 8-hour layover in BWI 1 week from today, and so I'm going to be hitting up that Bruins playoff game from, like I said, from the Baltimore airport.
You got
I did get lucky.
Hang on, you got a flight with an 8-hour layover?
That's right. Yeah. Well, it was the way to save hundreds and hundreds of dollars. But there is a little bit of a silver lining to that dark cloud, Brian, because friend of the podcast, the captain, just happens to be in town. I actually checked with him before I bought these tickets. And his plan is to pick me up from the airport, and we'll go out and get some lunch. And so I'll be hanging out with the captain for a couple hours in there. So it won't be a total loss, hopefully. Wow. I actually almost considered driving back with just because of the 8-hour layover, right? So if the captain was driving back to Maine, I thought maybe I'll just drive with him. It won't matter. I'll get back to Maine at the same time, whether I take the flight or drive with the captain because of the 8-hour layover, right? So, but he has his whole family and multiple dogs and his wife and kid with him, so it's just not going to be possible. So what I'm going to do is go to dinner. I'll fly arrive in Baltimore around 11. I'll go have a nice lunch with the captain, and then I'll come back and go belly up to a sports bar or something, wherever I can find the game there in the Baltimore terminal. So that's what's happened to me with that 2:00 matinee.
I see. The captain's down in Baltimore. Yeah, that makes sense. With his wife's family. Well, that'll actually be pretty awesome then, huh? That could have gone a lot worse.
Yeah. See, this is why I was saying I checked with the captain before I booked the flights. So that'll be interesting next weekend. We will have to do the podcast at a strange time this week, Brian. I meant to chitty chat with you about that before we started rolling here, but before the mics got heated up. But we'll have to record in the next episode of the good old System Failure podcast. Will be at a weird time for us.
Wait, and I just have one more question about this flight. Or I would be apprehensive about trying to do flying. I guess mostly. Well, have the TSA issues then mostly gone away?
Yeah. Yes. TSA, the thing where TSA wasn't getting paid got resolved. I think the Republicans finally caved and agreed to consider funding for ICE and then funding for the rest of Homeland Security separately, where TSA is a part of Homeland Security. So I'm anticipating no serious delays in the shameful and humiliating security lines. So hopefully it won't be a disaster where I miss a flight because you had to wait in a massive 3-hour line. But that was only at select airports. Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport was the worst afflicted with those massive lines winding around the terminal.
Okay, and then the other thing is, given, the crisis with Iran and the increase in gas prices, Like overall, how expensive were these plane tickets compared to normal when you were trying to book them?
Well, so I bought them I bought them in anticipation of that. So I bought them at the normal price, super cheap, like $300 or something like that.
That was a smart
But I was
move, huh?
Yeah, but I was wanting to buy. Yeah, I bought them a month or two ago. I guess it would be like what, late February, because that's when all this excitement with Iran started heating up, eh, Brian?
Yes. All right. Very good.
And what is the latest and greatest in Iran? Well, let's just say I got no idea and leave it at that. Brian, what do you think? Do we have a blockade? Are the Straits of Hormuz open? Are the Straits of Hormuz closed? Do we have a ceasefire? I've almost given up on the news. In fact, I'm kind of this whole fraught news cycle starting on February the 28th when we began the conflict with the Iranians. I mean, I had been refreshing the news sites and really binged like a news junkie this past 5 or 6 weeks here. And man, I don't know. I'm getting really, really tired of watching, especially because it does feel like reality is crumbling all around us, and it's really impossible to. It's difficult to figure out what's going on, or maybe more accurately said, the consensus reality is crumbling, and so each of us is living in we don't trust institutions, we don't trust the authorities, so each of us is living in our own little balkanized reality. And whereas I had been breathlessly refreshing the Wall Street Journal for updates and looking forward to Crystal and Sagar's latest drop on the podcast circuit, I think what I'm going to do is try to consume substantially less news. It really has been frustrating. It seems like every single weekend the Donald tweets something crazy, and then on Tuesday of every week he walks it all back so that the markets return to normal. And man, am I getting tired of getting caught up between ping-ponging back and forth between crisis and optimism. So yeah, maybe consuming less of the news is the way to go.
Well, I'll tell you what. Yeah, my attention span for the war in Iran is definitely starting to decrease. But they declared this ceasefire like over the weekend. But then Donald Trump said that the blockade was going to remain in place, and so the ceasefire lasted all of a few hours, and now ships are being blown up. And I think it's in line with Professor Jang's prediction that these ceasefires are just for show. I mean, there's just no way that we can actually have peace with Iran. And I think that things are just going to continue until things get worse and they institute a draft, or, they blow up the Temple Mount, or, something else cataclysmic happens.
Yeah, I mean, as long as the Straits of Hormuz remain control or remain under, or remain closed or remain under the exclusive control of the Iranians, I just think that alone is enough to trigger. You don't need any kind of disaster like some sort of an accidental on purpose destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque complex on the Temple Mount. You don't even need that. I think that just the clogging up the Straits of Hormuz is enough to grind global commerce to a virtual halt and initiate an economic collapse that is serious in nature. So yeah, I guess I'm inclined to agree with you, Brian. I mean, I don't feel like the situation is going to end well. But I am curious to find out what the situation is going to be like, and I'm just curious. So that's what has me refresh. I feel like we are the inheritors of this grand narrative. Like I've got above my computer, I've got the 11 books of Will and Ariel Durant's The Story of Civilization, and that's kind of a proxy or a stand-in for this grand narrative that we're all a part of. Who was it that has the line from the Dead Poet Society that the something play goes on and you may contribute a verse? That's how I feel about this wild story of history. It's like you've got all these history books with just the most harrowing tales in them, and we get to be present, as the latest chapters are written. And so refreshing the news feels to me like refreshing the history books, even though it's not exactly a one-to-one comparison. So that's what's had me maniacally, habitually, addictively, refreshing the old scroll feed. I especially like to look at the bond yields on the 10-year T-note. I see that as the canary in the coal mine. If those bond yields tick up over, if those bond yields tick up too high, right? The bond yields are the signal for how much demand there is for our treasury bonds, and that really, to me, seems to be like the linchpin um, that determines, that's like the first, that's gonna be the first thing to go, that yield on the 10-year T note, right? That's the supposedly the yield on the 10-year T note represents the risk or risk-free bonds, right? The premium for risk-free bonds. It's a benchmark figure. And if it gets up, but if it gets up much beyond 4.3, 4.4, we'll see major economic dysfunction and heartburn in America, because this is the rate at which, these are the rates on which mortgage rates are based. All borrowing rates are based on these central reserve rates. The cost of money for the banks to get is going to translate in the cost of the banks to furnish you with money. So anyway, yeah, I have been refreshing like a madman, and
Well, how's that canary doing? Is it pretty dead, or like how is the the 10-year T note looking?
when things look really dark and dour in Iran, it ticks up to like 4.4. And when things like right now, it's at 4.2. I think, where was it on Friday? Let me look it up here. 4.24 is where it ended. 4.25 is where it ended on Friday. And so that's a relatively sanguine note for the weekend. I mean, it has been ticking up into the red over the past few weeks, as mentioned, to the 4.4s. But yeah.
Well, I think that the ceasefire that was kind of declared over the weekend, I think it's like just for a few hours there, it kind of seemed like people believed that we were actually going to reach a peace agreement with Iran, and I think that with this with that coming to an end, the terminus of that ceasefire, I think that people are going to stop believing or having any hope that any kind of peaceable agreement is going to be reached, would be my prediction. I just don't think that the Donald can declare victory too many more times, even though he's done it like 16 or 17 times. I just don't think there's any meat on that bone left. And I would expect that public perception is really going to start to shift here drastically, and that we won't fall for it too many more times.
Yeah, you said it, Brian. Every time that Donald declares victory, it drains a little bit of the power and momentum from the next time he declares victory, because it's not based on anything in reality. It's just based on jawboning and bloviating into microphones to try to keep the price of oil from completely collapsing, or I should say, from completely exploding. So yeah, it's been it's been a wild time trying to follow the comings and goings, the latest updates on the news. And oh, by the way, that line that is so famously quoted in the Dead Poets Society, it's Walt Whitman. "The powerful play goes on," wrote Whitman, "and you may contribute a verse." That's what bounces around my head here. There's a connection between the news that's coming out in the grand narrative of history, of which we're all a part, as already mentioned. And so, so that's what's had me in a refreshing the news like some kind of a junkie. But I think that potentially, maybe once the Bruins are out the NHL playoffs, maybe I'll try a week long media blackout. Because it's certainly the case that when like the news sort of becomes history, but years in arrears. I know that rhymes, but I think that's the best way to say it. Years in arrears, right there. I mean, you don't like, for example, I suspect that when we look back at history, like when you crack a history book in the 25th century, I think it's going to have as the end date of the American Empire in the year 2008, when we, started using our Federal Reserve to straight up purchase bad debts. I think that's the moment when the U.S. currency will be seen to have gone off the rails. But you have to, but the news has to be digested and interpreted and verified before it becomes history, right? There's a whole process of manufacturing history, as it were. And well, I mean, I guess that's all I really have to say on that. Except for I wanted to use that as a segue to talk about the 1956 Suez Crisis. It's interesting to compare it to the present goings on.
Well, I would
But I
just
wonder
say
if you have any
about
comments before we get.
I would just say about history that the narrative has to coalesce into something substantial, or and I would agree with your assessment about the end of the American Empire in 2008. Yeah.
Well, the end of the American Empire is frequently conceptualized. If we somewhat recklessly and prematurely, are calling a time of death on the American Empire in 2008, period, the time, the date, the year in which the British Empire is commonly conceived to have come to its end is 1956 in the aftermath of World War II with the Suez Canal crisis. Everyone knows, I'm sure, that the Suez Canal is how you get from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, right? The Suez Canal is what allows shipping to container ships or maritime traffic of all kinds to not have to go all the way south down around the Horn of South Africa and then up the east coast of Africa into the Indian Ocean, right? It allows you to just go from the Mediterranean, like you could sail from Italy to India in a tiny fraction of the amount of time that it would take you if you had to go all the way around Africa, right? So this is the Suez Canal. It connects the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, the same sea that Moses supposedly parted in order to allow the Israelites to escape slavery in Egypt. And in 1956, the Egyptian president, this guy Gamal Abdel Nasser, he decided he was building the Aswan Dam, and the plan was to dam up the Nile River and provide power for power out there in the desert for the entire country of Egypt. But I guess he had some kind of funding in place that fell through, and so as an alternative, Nasser decided to nationalize the Suez Canal, which was dug in 1888, the same year, that was finalized in 88, the same year that Jack the Ripper was stabbing prostitutes in London's East End. That's when the Suez Canal opened, and so, during the height of the Victorian British Empire. And so Nasser decided he was going to nationalize that canal, and much like Mohammad Mossadegh 3 years prior in Iran, the idea here was that, well, hang on a second, we have this infrastructure. Why is this infrastructure? Why is the revenue generated from this infrastructure going to these foreign people? Why don't we keep it for the people of Egypt or the people of Iran, what have you? So that's exactly what Nasser did. He up and nationalized the Suez Canal, took it over, took control from a joint venture between the French and the British. Then here's where the parallels between, here's where some interesting parallels start to come in. So the French and the British hatched a plot in order to get the canal back. They convinced the Israelis to invade Egypt, and indeed the Israelis did invade. Their plan was to have the Israelis invade Egypt all the way to overtake big chunks of overtake all the Sinai. Obviously, the Sinai is that delta-shaped peninsula that connects the Levant to Egypt, like it connects the Middle East to Egypt, right? That delta-shaped peninsula is the Sinai, and the Israelis took over the entire Sinai. And the plan, from the point of view of the French and the British, was once the Israelis were occupying the canal zone, that would give the French and the British an excuse to deploy quote unquote peacekeeping troops to the canal zone, and that way they could regain control of it. So here we see the first years of the Israeli state working closely with along back channels with the French and the British in order to screw over the Egyptians and Gamal Abdel Nasser, their president. But it didn't. But we mentioned earlier that the Suez Crisis, it was really seen as the end of the British Empire. Perhaps a more accurate way to put it is a passing of the torch from the British Empire being the dominant force in international geopolitics, right, to the American empire force in international geopolitics. Again, it's a baton handoff. And the reason that we see this baton handoff is because President Eisenhower was enraged by these actions by the French and the British. He thought it was a shocking provocation, especially so close on the heels of World War II, to be playing this game again. And so he threatened to sell off all of the American holdings of the British pound sterling and collapse the British currency if they didn't withdraw from the canal zone, and that is what happened. So the Suez Crisis involved the end of an empire. It involved Israel, and it is a similar pattern to what happened in Iran in 1953 with the assassination of Mohammad Mossadegh after he attempted to nationalize the oil fields of Iran. Similarly, you see President Nasser wanting to nationalize the Suez Canal. And so and the canal is a super important waterway, and so that also figures into the current Iran crisis. So as you can see, Brian, there's a bunch of parallel lines to be drawn from the Suez Crisis of 1956 to the present crisis we've got going on with the Strait of Hormuz today. And perhaps the most significant line to be drawn is the death of empire, the end of empire. The death of the British Empire in '56 and the possible destruction of the American empire now. So interesting stuff. I thought the Suez Crisis was a good one to bring up here, just given where we're at in history.
Well, it's fascinating the way that, the destiny of empires, even though they're, thousands of miles from the Middle East, just continues to be controlled by, the cradle of civilization there. But I guess that's why it is the cradle of civilization.
Yeah, it is strange. Like, history really does rhyme in an eerie way. Another one is the graveyard of empires. The classic, the classic terminology for Afghanistan, right? It's like multiple empires have gone there to die. Like the British Empire, American Empire, the Soviet Union. You could even make an argument for Alexander. His invasion of Western Asia petered out there. It's like it's just very mountainous, very hilly, and it's a difficult place to prosecute some kind of an armed conflict, and because of that, empires often end up feeling tempted to, through hubris, feel like they should invade Afghanistan for one reason or another, and it goes terribly each and every time. So yeah, history really is interesting. It just is so wild the way that it rhymes.
Well, I guess, I got a root for the end of the American Empire and its foreign entanglements, which seems like an inevitability at this time. And it would just be amazing if we had just have all this bounty of, resources and people and whatnot in the West. And by the West, I mean, North and South America. And it'd just be crazy if we could divest ourselves from this nonsense, which seems like it'll happen. And man, if we could just get if we could just go back to how America used to be, and sort of isolationist and not involved in this stuff. But it seems impossible, just given the what we were just talking about. The fascination or what's the word? The mania, I guess, with the goings-ons in the Middle East. There's just no way to do it. But we certainly could. If there's a new era of prosperity, maybe we can somehow get past it somehow. But I don't know.
Well, you really said it. The American empire seems like it's scheduled for collapse. Really, maybe the great lesson in history is that all empires collapse, and it's just a matter of time. Or because an empire has to constantly be expanding, right? It's not stable if it's not expanding. That's kind of the defining property of an empire, right? This is what it's the crux of Christianity. There is tension between empire and sustainability, right? There are two polar opposites. You can either have empire that constantly expands, right? That metastasizes, right? That what's the old quote? The constant expansion without regard for environment is the logic of a cancer cell, right? So you can either have empire or you can have long-term sustainability, right? You've got to choose one or the other. Fascinatingly, the oligarchies throughout history are always keen to start up an empire. For the rest of us, regular folks who don't stand to pile up fortunes that you could never hope to spend in your lifetime or your next your next several generations lifetime. For regular people, sustainability is vastly preferable to empire, and that's really what the debt forgiveness of the old debt forgiveness thing, pre-Roman times. Virtually all civilizations employed some form of regular, periodic, broad scale debt forgiveness. That was their way of choosing sustainability over empire. And it seems like we chose long ago, maybe post World War II, that America too was going to make this horrible choice and choose empire and reject sustainability. And it seems like it's always the ruling classes who make this decision on all of our behalf, and that's a major problem. And the engine that drives history.
Yeah, I mean, well, like George Washington and all these other people are supposed to be like Masons, right? And there's all this Masonic imagery in Washington, D.C. And I guess I don't quite know how that figures in. It seems like, I mean, the vision at first was to, like, obviously, get rid of taxation without representation and, be a rebuttal to empire. But on the other hand, it seems like these secret societies also are deeply interested in the goings-ons in the Middle East. And I don't know quite how to resolve that contradiction.
Yeah, it's like well, the Freemasons, they have some kind of a an iconographic or symbological or even maybe a direct connection to the Knights Templar of the Middle Ages. The Knights Templar were the proto-bankers who reintroduced the concept of banking to Europe after the fall of Rome. Of course, lending money at interest got such a bad name after the collapse of the Roman Empire that the Christian Church, the Catholic Church, had outlawed it. Right? They had not. It wasn't just Dr. Michael Hudson, a one-time guest on this very podcast, is always careful to make the distinction. We use the church called making loans usury. In the way that Christians read that today, is usury means like excessive interest. Like if you go to a loan shark, then you're going to get a usurious interest rate. But Dr. Hudson makes the point that in none of the languages that originally made up scripture, there's not separate words between loans and usury. It's all the same word, loaning money at interest, right? That is the thing. If you loan, it's like having sex, right? You have to do it with contraceptive, with protection. You can't just go around making unprotected loans. You have to have the periodic debt forgivenesses demanded in the New Testament. Debt forgivenesses that were ubiquitous in the Near East during the Bronze Age. The debt forgiveness that saved Greek society, right, just across the Adriatic, right? In Greece, Solon of Athens had a massive debt forgiveness in the 6th century BC, and that set the stage for the flowering of Athenian society in the 4th century. Periclean Athens, democracy, drama, Plato, Aristotle, that whole crowd. And I forgot where I was even going with all this, Brian. But just like the point is just that that the Romans made this horrible choice to pursue empire instead of sustainability. And the way that they made that choice was by eschewing debt forgiveness in all of its forms. Christianity was a plea to return to the debt forgiveness of pre-Roman societies, but the Roman oligarchy altered the meaning of forgiveness to mean forgiveness from sin, right? Forgiveness from sexual, misdeeds versus forgiveness of actual financial debts. And as a result of their choice, like Icarus on his waxen wings, the Romans flew so close to the sun that their wings melted, and they crashed back to Earth in proportion to the massive hoard of wealth that they piled up under these unsustainable practices.
Well,
anyway, that's my long. Oh, go ahead.
Well, the Knights Templar, I mean, they were trying to do banking, right? They were the proto bankers, and
yes, yeah. The Knights Templar were said to have discovered a mysterious secret in the ruins of Solomon's Temple, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is built today. Right? There's the first Solomon's Temple demolished in 596 when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem. 596 BC when the Babylonian king destroyed Jerusalem. When the Jews were released from like the Persians, right, the Iranians, they conquered Babylon, released the Jews returned to Babylon, returned to Jerusalem. They constructed the second temple. This in the 5th century BC or the 6th century BC. And that temple stood for 500 years until the Romans came and knocked it down in 70 AD. That's Titus, the son of the emperor and the future emperor himself. Titus in 70 AD destroys the Temple of Solomon. But the foundation of that old temple, the second temple of Solomon, is the Wailing Wall. The Western Wall still stands today, where like the hardcore Jewish where the hardcore Jewish observers in Jerusalem go to pray. They tuck little pieces of prayer paper into that wall. But what's built on top of that is the Al-Aqsa Mosque complex with the Dome of the Rock, right? And that's the thing that some commentators are worried that the Israelis will blow up as a pretext for unleashing no holds barred holy war. But put that aside, right? During the Crusades, during 1095, the Europeans invaded Holy Land. And when the Crusaders took Jerusalem, the Knights Templar, the legend goes, found some mystery of immense value in the old, in the catacombs of the old Solomon's Temple, the building that's that the Western Wall still stands today, and is the Wailing Wall, that's important to the Jewish faith. And but but the legend, the whispers about the Knights Templar, right? They never really say what the Knights found, but in reality, the Knights began extending loans, right? They did, they didn't have interest rates, right? They could evade the church's ban on usury, because what they were really making money off of was exchange rates. But really, an interest rate and an exchange rate can work exactly the same if you think about it. Well, the deal was you would visit the Knights Temple Church. I mean, it still stands. The Knights Temple Church in London is still standing today. The one in Paris was destroyed when the Pope and the King of France cracked down on the Knights Templar in 1305, like the first Black Friday. But you would deposit your money at the church. They'd give you a letter of credit. You could then travel to the Holy Land unmolested by brigands and bandits on the pilgrim trail to the Holy Land, because you're just carrying paper, that says the Knights Templar owe your money. You're not carrying actual coins, right? What you're carrying is useless to the cut purses on the pilgrim trail. And then when you get to Jerusalem, you trade the paper, you get your coins back, right? It was a good business model, but really it was loaning money, right? I mean, and then the Knights would build an exchange rate in, right? So you would lose a little bit, you would pay a little bit to the Knights for this service. You would get a little bit less money back in Jerusalem than you deposited in London, right? You can see how it would work. Well, loaning money is a really, there's a reason it's treated with such mysticism in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the Knights Templar soon became fabulously wealthy, to where they challenged the power of the Pope, and especially King Philip IV of France, who found himself in massive debt to the Knights Templar. And so he is the one who prevailed upon Pope Clement V to crack down on the Knights and declare their organization illegal. Pope Clement V, he owed a political favor to Philip IV, and so that's how Philip IV got leverage over the Pope. He had been integral, Philip had, in getting Clement V, elected to the papacy. Well, it's interesting to me that the Knights Templar are supposed to have found something of immense mysterious value beneath the temple, in the ruins of the old Temple of Solomon. But what they really discovered was this. Was debt, the structure of debt, how it works, how it can amass huge amounts of wealth unexpectedly, right? The human brain doesn't have a good intuition for compound interest rates. Like if I tell you to fold a piece of paper in half 11 times, right, you're going to picture, Brian, something that looks like maybe the New York City phone book. I hope that reference isn't too dusty and dated. We used to have phone books, and they used to be kind of thick, and you would imagine that if you folded a piece of paper in half 100 times, you'd get a pretty thick wad of paper. The answer is that if you fold a piece of paper in half 100 times, right, you're going to get a wad of paper that's thicker than the observable universe, right? Because it's like that old parable about the grains of rice on the chessboard. You start with 1 grain of rice in the first space in the chessboard, then 2, then 4, then 8, doubling it every time. But by the time you get to the 64th square on the 8x8 chessboard, it's like more rice than is in the king's kingdom. You get to know the parable, Brian. Well, anyway, this long rambling thing is all about what the Knights Templar uncovered. There's sometimes people think of it as the Holy Grail, or conceptualize it as the Holy Grail. But what they really found beneath the Temple Mount was they rediscovered the power of charging financial interest on loans. And so, it's interesting how that fits into the stories going on today with respect to the Iran war and international finance and the state of Israel.
Sure. So, I mean, how long after the order, 666 on the Friday the 13th? I mean, so at that time, the church had, banned usury, right? But so how long does it take for it to get co-opted?
For it to get co-opted, meaning that the church is now okay with loans, or meaning that how long until or how long until the Knights Templar themselves are co-opted?
The first one.
First one, okay. So the story of the Catholic Church being okay, it really has to do with the Protestant Reformation of the 1500s. During the Protestant Reformation, the proto banking houses that were rising in Europe prevailed upon guys like John Calvin, noted leaders of the Reformation, prevailed upon John Calvin to make the Reformation tolerant of usury, tolerant of interest rates, tolerant of the practice of lending money. And so the Catholic Church had to follow suit in the centuries after that. They had to soften their stance and give us what we were talking about earlier, the idea that okay, excessive usury is the sin here. Loaning money at smaller interest rates perfectly okay.
And so, in which
And
year was the Friday the 13th decree?
1305.
So it was like 200 years then. It sounds like.
Yeah, a couple hundred years. Yeah. Well, during that 200-year period, the Knights Templar. So the real key here is that the King of England, right? To him, where Philip the Fourth of France, the Knights Templar were a major liability because he owed them so much money. Across the English Channel in England, the King of England, who was the King of England? Was it Edward? I can't remember. But across the Channel in England, the king, to him, the Knights Templar were huge. It's Edward the First in 1305. I think it's Edward the Second, and I think it's 1308 is the first Black Friday. Anyhow, the King of England, to him, the Knights Templar were political allies, and he really, when the Pope issued his papal bull condemning the Knights Templar to execution, to confessions via torture, accusations of sodomy and devil worship. King Edward II saw this and was like, these guys are my political allies. He dragged his feet on carrying out the Pope's edict for a couple of crucial months, and during that time, the Knights Templar disappeared underground. And there's a lot of interesting symbology. The idea here is that they disappeared into Scotland, right? And this is really where you start to depart from established history and start talking about conspiracy theories. But there was the Peasants' Revolt of 1389, some 80 years after the first Black Friday. There was a massive uprising in which 100,000 angry peasants marched on London demanding the abolition of serfdom and peasantry. And that incident apparently was, apparently there's whispers and rumors that the Knights Templar from an underground hidden position were responsible for the Peasants' Revolt of 1389. There's also the Battle of Bannockburn, where, Braveheart, let's see, man, the Battle of Bannockburn, I think it's the successor to the guy played in Braveheart. Anyhow, there was a big fight between the Scots and the English at the Battle of Bannockburn in the mid-1300s, and at that fight, too, supposedly, the Scottish Knights were augmented. Supposedly Knights Templar were seen fighting alongside the Scottish Knights during the Battle of Bannockburn. And then there's Rosslyn Chapel, right, where Rosslyn is out there. It's just a couple miles. It's like maybe 10 miles south of Edinburgh in Scotland. And the Rosslyn Chapel is filled with Knights Templar iconography, things like the Apprentice Pillar, pictures of things that could be construed as mushrooms. It's very odd. The Rosslyn Chapel is just, it's a chapel that's loaded not just with Knights Templar symbology, but also Freemason symbology. It's a weird syncretic mixture of those two, leading people to believe there's some kind of underground continuity between the Knights Templar of the 11th and 12th centuries and the Freemasons, who finally emerged from hiding and finally declared their Grand Lodge in London just a few years after the very first central bank, the Bank of England, was established. Right, it's like 1692 and 1698 are the two dates when you get the Bank of England, and you also get the public declaration of the Freemasons within short succession. And as you said, Brian, bringing it all back around here. This is about 100 years before the American Revolution. So a century after the Freemasons announced themselves in London, or you have all these guys who are declared Freemasons. Washington and Jefferson, all the founding fathers were all Freemasons, and that really makes you wonder. Was the American Empire founded as some kind of was the American democracy founded as some sort of experiment in democracy, really, or were these guys working together, right, to buttress their own wealth, and to create, to make themselves wealthy versus trying to create a sustainable society over the long haul? Well, one thing is for sure, whatever the intentions of the founding fathers, we have surely embraced empire and rejected sustainability. Wouldn't you say, Brian?
Yes. Well, you hear, Dave Smith, he wants to advocate, he does advocate for just trying to go back to how America was before, the Federal Reserve and all that. And Yeah, the founding fathers, they were, against political parties, and the guy on the $20 bill there, yeah, he was famously opposed to the Federal Reserve. Andrew Jackson. Is it?
Yeah. Andrew Jackson, yeah, the man who swore up such a storm he worked so blue that his parrot had to be removed from his funeral because the thing would not stop squawking out, obscenities. Andrew Jackson, the man who was in a duel with one of his hated rivals, and he stood there and took the bullet from the other guy, just took a musket ball to the rib cage, so that then he could line up his shot carefully and execute his hated rival. Andrew Jackson, who on his deathbed said, "Well, at least I beat the banks." His dying words were that he beat the bank, meaning what you're saying, Brian, meaning the attempts by the Bank of England to create franchises in America. And they did, they briefly established one. Alexander Hamilton, the man on the $10 bill, was a noted proponent of establishing a Federal Reserve Bank here in the United States. And they established like the first Bank of America. The first Bank of America was like, maybe it was chartered for 10 years in the late 1700s or early 1800s. It was such a disaster that's why Andrew Jackson, the first presidential candidate from the frontier, which back then was meant Tennessee, Andrew Jackson was the guy who who wanted to defeat that attempt to establish a central bank in America. There's also the Abraham Lincoln story about the Rothschilds banks wanted to set up franchises here in America. Remember that one, Brian? The Rothschilds wanted to loan us money at a crazy interest rate in order to prosecute the Civil War. So Abraham Lincoln just printed his own currency, the greenback. Yeah, we don't need to borrow from you first and then print our own currency. We can just print our own currency and manage inflation from there. But yes, sorry, you asked me a question and then I went on a long rambling thing here. Talk about Andrew Jackson and the first bank. Yep, that's it, Brian. You're exactly right. The founding fathers, or at least the second generation of founding fathers, like Andrew Jackson, rejected the bank on its face, because they could see that there was something sinister about it. Just like the Roman Catholic Church in the aftermath of the fall of Rome.
It's just hard to trust, I guess, because all the most recent presidents are Skull and Bones members, but I guess that's different than being a Freemason, or it's hard to be clear, how all these secret societies.
The Skull and Bones, the Skull and Crossbones specifically, is an old symbol of the Knights Templar. Right, the Knights Templar would bury their dead in graves with crossed legs. Right, and so the Templar graves would have the skull with the two crossed, femur bones on them to indicate the presence of a dead Knight Templar. And the other thing interesting about the Skull and Bones, like the age of piracy in the Caribbean, right? This comes about directly in the aftermath of the Treaty of Westphalen in 1649, because the point of the Treaty of Westphalen was that we're going to eliminate the international influence of the Pope, so that polities that fancy themselves Protestant, like perhaps Czechia, would be given the choice whether they want to be Protestant or Catholic, and the Pope's no longer allowed to cross those international borders and try to affect that determination. Well, in the way that we're going to, establishing international borders and creating the modern nation state is exactly what the Treaty of Westphalen did in 1649. But meanwhile, across the Atlantic in the newly discovered Americas, that there was a lot of confusion there. Like they didn't really, it was just like a lot of colonies, but no one really, it was like, there was a big push. Let's put it this way. There was a big push by the crowned heads of Europe to make sure that anyone who's doing any fighting is doing it under the banner of a specific nation's flag, right? We cannot have people. It's illegal. Pirates, ye be warned, right? That they had a campaign where they were very specific about hanging people that operated military ships, without a national flag, right? But it was a new thing, the Treaty of Westphalen, and so the golden age of piracy in the Spanish Main, the Caribbean, and the east coast of America, and and the east coast of even like Venezuela and Maracaibo and places like that in the southern Caribbean. All of that was just a very brief period while we kind of sorted out this Treaty of Westphalen how our nation state's going to work sort of thing. By the end of the period, guys like Francis Drake, Queen Elizabeth the First was giving letters of marque, MARQUE, to guys like Francis Drake, basically making these pirates into official arms of the British government, and that kind of getting around the piracy thing that way. But the Skull and Crossbones, right, is one of these symbols that got adopted. The imposition of the nation states on international geopolitics, right? The people who were opposed to that, the pirates, they used the same old Knights Templar symbol of the crossed skull and bones, right, to show that they were against this whole that they were outside of the new international structure of nation states. And so that's why so the skull and crossbones are also related to the shadowy banking houses and the dynastic families behind them, like the Bushes, right? So like George Bush, they would do bizarre, like the skull and bone, the bonesmen at Yale. You can see them in this movie. They're depicted in this movie, The Good Shepherd, with Matt Damon, which is all about the transformation of the OSS into the CIA in the direct aftermath of World War II. And in that movie, they show that the bonesmen, what they do is they dress up in drag, they do weird homoerotic things, just because it's like the Epstein files of the late 1800s and early 1900s, right? The bonesmen, or you would be dressed in that movie. Matt Damon is dressed as like a woman having to do some embarrassing performance because that's how you get the compromat on people to make sure that they're in the club and you control them. That's the story behind the Yale Bonesmen. They too are related to the Freemasons and to the Knights Templar, of the Middle Ages.
Yeah, it seems like it's the same sort of lineage then that, like George Washington and the founding fathers to, like your Bush family and the other bonesmen that have been in control of the country. Maybe, it's just the difference is that there was a whole frontier to conquer and, fuel for the machine of empire. Whereas now, those new frontiers are gone, so there's nothing to do but, cannibalize the populace to enrich the upper class at this point.
That's it. Yep, I think that's I think you pretty much laid it out there, Brian. That's really a much shorter way of everything I was trying to say. I should have just said that.
All right.
So I want to pivot the conversation here, but keeping all this in mind, pivot the conversation to what's going on today in American society. As you can see, the stress of collapsing empire is it's affecting everyone. So I first want to talk about the warehouse fires, Brian. Have you seen these? There was a big warehouse fire in Alberta. Did you see the video of the man like lighting those things on fire up in Canada?
This is the first I've heard of this.
Oh, okay. Well, basically, warehouse arson, disgruntled. I'm just reading the headline off Fox News here. Disgruntled worker invokes Luigi Mangione in a $500 million warehouse inferno he filmed in anti-capitalist rage. Basically, there's a picture of a man with a lighter, and it's like it was one of these paper companies. Which one was it? Kimberly-Clark in Ontario. That's where it was, not Alberta. Kimberly-Clark Distribution Center up in Canada. And the man filmed himself burning it to the ground. Like he burnt all these huge, spools of paper, setting them on fire and causing $500 million worth of damages. And the whole time he's saying, you should have paid us a living wage. All you had to do was pay us a living wage. If you just would have paid us a living wage, this wouldn't have happened to you. So that's very interesting. It's showing how, American society is starting to crumble as the people at the top are used to increasing their fortunes every single year. And if they can't do it through expansion, the only way left for them to do it is by the dispossession of their own people. There's been a few other warehouse fires that maybe people think that Reddit says there's like copycats. I'm not really able to verify that. But this warehouse fire sure was interesting. I think that popped up. That happened a week ago Friday, and his video of doing all this damage, made the rounds this week on social media. So yeah, that's interesting stuff there, Brian. And then we also had the Sam Altman stalker. Did you hear about this guy?
No.
Sam Altman, of course, is the CEO of OpenAI, the company that makes ChatGPT. And this 20-year-old dude from Texas drove himself out. He wrote a lengthy manifesto about the dangers of AI and how Sam Altman is opening Pandora's box and unleashing horrors upon the world that can never be stuffed back into said box. And so he took it upon himself to drive out to Sam Altman's home in San Francisco and chuck a Molotov cocktail at it, then drive out to similarly attack OpenAI's headquarters in downtown San Fran. And so that's interesting. And again, this man also is invoking Luigi, the man who last year shot down the CEO of United Healthcare in the streets of Manhattan. Just a few snippets here from the Wall Street Journal coverage, Brian. It says here, months before his arrest for allegedly attempting to murder the chief executive of OpenAI, Daniel Moreno Gama suggested, quote, Luigiing some tech CEOs, unquote, in an internet chat. Moreno Gama, age 20, traveled from the Houston area to San Francisco, threw a Molotov cocktail at Sam Altman's mansion, and then attacked OpenAI's headquarters entrance, planning to burn the building down. The incident spotlights a brewing anti-corporate fervor in some internet subcultures, amplified by the national attention on Mangione, an Ivy League-educated 27-year-old who has pleaded not guilty. Only weeks ago, Jamal Abdul Karim, 29, was charged with sparking a blaze at a Kimberly-Clark warehouse in Southern California. Oh, okay. He complained about wages and comparing himself to Mangione, federal prosecutors said. I see. So this is in Ontario, California. I was thinking this is Ontario, Canada. So this is all taking place within the United States, Brian. It really seems like there was a lot of concern about copycats, attacks on CEOs, or violent revolt from the lower classes. And it seems like, as this madness in Iran unfolds, people are starting to snap.
Well, I actually did see like some tweets. Because Sam Altman's his like history with his sister or something, where there's some accusations of, I don't know, like sexual assault or something, and then kind of screwing her over financially.
She says that Sam Altman's own sister accuses him of incestuous rape, is what I understand.
Well, this is, I'd heard, let's see, I think someone was like on Tucker Carlson's podcast. I heard someone go on in some length about this story a while ago, and then it was like breaching to the surface again, like just last week. And then this Molotov cocktail happened at Sam Altman's place. And it seemed to kind of distract from all that, and so I know people were saying that there was some kind of connection. But on the other hand, there is like this apparently this growing anti-corporatist sentiment, which is easy to understand. So I don't quite know what to make of all that.
Well, Brian, I just got one more shell to lob into this, and that is the revolutions of 1848. I think you and me have talked about this offline any number of times, Brian, but just for those who don't know, during 1848, there was a massive wave of revolutions that rocked the European continent. Multiple ruling families were deposed. This was a major transition point between the European continent being ruled by monarchies, and then after 1848, the European continent was largely ruled by parliaments and governments and congresses, things of this nature. Right, the parliaments kind of took over from rule by kings and queens, and 1848 was a huge turning point in that process. This Ode to Joy by Beethoven, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, Brian. The classic, the classic tune. Everyone,
I've played it on violin many times.
That's it, the Ode to Joy, right? Well, that was Beethoven nicknamed his Ninth Symphony, his final symphony, Ode to Joy, and what he was borrowing the name of a poem from this guy called Friedrich Schiller from the late part of the 1700s, right? Concurrently with the French and American revolutions, Friedrich Schiller had composed this poem, Ode to Freedom. Beethoven changed it to Ode to Joy. But the point of Beethoven's symphony, the point of his music, was to capture the feeling of the excitement of the liberation of Europe, namely the American and French revolutions. Well, that spirit of revolution, eventually came home to roost on the American continent in 1848. Interesting little aside here, the Brits, separated from the European continent by the British Channel, saw what was happening and realized, the wealthy elite in Britain realized that they needed to cede control, substantial amounts of political power, to democratic assemblies, to regular people, to the parliament. So the Brits ceded a bunch of, they sort of, their ruling class, seeing what was going on the continent in 1848, gave away a lot of their power. The ruling class did, and as a result of that, that kept the monarchy became more ceremonial and less the center of power during that era. And that switch explains why the English monarch is so prominent, where you don't see the kinds of coronations and drama involving the royal family and other European countries, because they all were overthrown in the wave of revolutions that swept Europe in 1848. And the final point here is that here in America, the revolutions of 1848 terrified the Carnegies and the Rockefellers of the Gilded Age and prompted them to limit their exploitation of their own proletariat, their own working class. That's where you get things like the Carnegie Foundation, and the Rockefeller endowments for hospitals and things of this nature. Right? The Gilded Age oligarchy in America, sort of like England, saw that they needed to restrain themselves in some way to avoid the kinds of things we're seeing happening at this Kimberly-Clark factory in Southern California, or in San Francisco, where a man showing up to throw Molotov cocktails at Sam Altman. So what I'm trying to say here is it seems as though the ruling aristocracies of the 1800s, the 19th century, comprehended on some level that you can't just dispossess your own working class, or you can only dispossess them to a certain level before you will lose everything. And that nuance, that sense of responsibility to one's own country, is what we are lacking here in modern times, Brian. It's what's landed us in Iran. It's what's caused the massive redistribution of wealth in America to be concentrated in ever fewer hands at the very tippy top, while life gets more and more economically precarious for the rest of us here at the bottom. We're lacking any sort of responsibility on the part of our ruling elite, and in that way, they match the aristocracies of the ancient Roman Empire, who behaved similarly and couldn't countenance the idea of the debt forgiveness contained within Christianity, and insisted on putting the pedal to the metal on the empire until the very last, when the whole thing collapsed in one of the most spectacular disasters in recorded history.
Well, yeah, I mean, the wheel in the sky keeps on turning, huh?
Yeah, it sure does, Brian. You said it. Well, what do you think, Brian? We had a whole list of other topics to get to here, but I think that we are out of time for this week. What do you say?
All right, yeah, sounds good. We'll have to get to them next week.
Yeah, all right. That sounds good, Brian. All right, folks. Well, if you are enjoying today's conversation, we invite you to pay us a little visit over to systemfailure.org. There you can get in touch with either Brian or myself and let us know what you think of our performance on the mics today. You can accomplish that feat by visiting the About page and just clicking on the appropriate name. Furthermore, if you enjoyed my lengthy opinions about the Knights Templar and the Freemasons, well, you can sign up to receive my weekly historical essays right there in your email inbox. Right there at systemfailure.org, you can't miss the sign up, the box where you enter your email. It's right there. It's obvious. You can't miss it. Okay, yeah, I think that's about it for this week, Brian. I'm looking forward to coming back next week and seeing what happens with how the wheel in the sky further turns over the next seven days, or I suppose 5 days. We'll be coming back with a little bit of a abbreviated schedule, but yeah, man.
All right, we'll see you, folks.
I think that's about it for this week.
All right,
bye-bye.